My name is Sheila Gregory Thomas, and you asked me where I was born. Yes, Atlantic City, New Jersey, and I am now 83 years old.
And so you grew up in Atlantic City?
Yes, I did.
Interesting. What was that like?
Well, it was lovely because it was a resort town. I was within walking distance of the beach and the boardwalk. So that was so enjoyable. I really grew up with sand in my shoes, as the saying goes, you know, loving to be on the beach, loving the sand and the sea. And for me, it was a little quiet in that I was the tail end of a large family. I had 5 siblings, but when I came along, the one closest to me in age was 11. And then when I was, I'd say, approximately 8 years old, they were all gone. And so I was there 11 years younger than all of them. My parents, interestingly, each were 10 years younger than their siblings. So there the 3 of us were, each the last, yeah. In fact, they used to call me, my brothers and sisters, some of them used to refer to me as the last of the Mohicans. And I was, yes.
And did you, could you tell us about your father and your mother, each of their families, where they came from? A little bit about that?
Certainly. My mother was born in Austin, Texas, and so was her father, and so was her mother. And her parents met at Oberlin at college in Ohio. They both were there during a time, this was the 1800s, when the Civil War was about to start and then actually began. So they were there to get an education, which they might not have been able to get in Texas because of their ancestry. My mother's father was of mixed ancestry. His father was white, and the mother was mixed, mulatto, I guess it would have been called. At any rate, the father sent my mother's father to Oberlin for school to be educated. My mother's mother, Susie, was in the same exact situation, though she was sent to a boarding school first in Baltimore, and she was there and afterwards sent to Oberlin to go to school, and there she met Hugh, her to-be husband. So that was my mother's family.
So these are your grandparents?
Yes,
right?
Yes.
Do you know what each studied at Oberlin?
I only know that my grandmother, Susie, studied music. Yes.
And Oberlin is known for their music.
Well, that was her major, but Hugh I'm not certain about.
Okay.
Yeah, very uncertain.
And then after Oberlin, they settled where?
In Texas. I'm trying to think of the little town. It was outside of Austin. Begins with a B, Bastrop. They spent some time in Bastrop, Texas, yes.
And that's where they had
their
family.
family.
And their family.
They had, yes. And in fact, Hugh, my grandfather, was quite an entrepreneur. As I understood from my mother, his father wanted to send him to law school, but he declined. He met Susie and just wanted to settle down, be married, and stay there in Texas and not be sent away to school. So there was something I was about to say. Okay, ask me again.
Okay, so they settled in Texas.
Yes, okay. Yeah, so what I wanted to go forward with is that he really was quite an entrepreneur, and he ended up owning some saloons. And saloons were gathering places back in those days for political people to come in and discuss politics and so forth. And he had one in particular that was called the Black Elephant Saloon, and that was a meeting place for people to come and discuss politics as well as just to imbibe, yeah, and be social. So he also was an alderman. He served as an alderman in Austin. They moved back to Texas, and they lived in Bastrop, Texas for a while. But then eventually they lived in Austin, and a house that my grandfather, Hugh, had built for his family, which consisted then of 4 daughters, is now a Texas historic landmark. Because he was an entrepreneur, as I said. He was African American, white father and mixed mother, at a time when very few black people were able to do things as he did. And he did it obviously because he had the support he had from his father, I'm sure. So he owned 2 saloons in Austin, and the Black Elephant was one of them.
Which you said there was a lot of political discussions.
Yes, I read that the saloons were meeting places for people to discuss politics.
Yes.
And so he was the owner of the Black Elephant Saloon, and he also became an alderman, and he attended conferences, political conferences, because I've seen references to him in newspapers from that period saying that Hugh Hancock had thus and so to say, a statement to make. And so he was very active. And then at a certain point, things became difficult. I guess it was, he was born, I think, in 1855. And Susie was born about 1856, approximately, his wife. So I'm trying to remember the year, the time, but I think it was about 1890 something or 1900 when the atmosphere there for them became difficult. And he didn't evidently feel safe any longer, I'm assuming. And I can't remember the circumstances that did prevail then, except that for black people at a certain time, periodically, every so often, people would, really become hostile and make things difficult for them. And so he sold the house, and they left Texas, and they lived in several places after that. They went into Illinois. They were, I think, Illinois. And they went to Oregon, and then they went to Idaho, of all places. And so he was doing work that didn't put him in charge, any longer.
Do you know what work?
At one place, I think he was worked on the bar. I think maybe that was in Idaho. I think another place, I understand, what was it? Just, nothing on a professional level. I can't remember. Maybe, I just don't recall right now. Yeah. But it was nothing like before. Everything changed. I believe one of his daughters married 2 of them, I think, while they were in Illinois. And my mother and one of the others was with the wife and father there in Idaho when Susie, my grandmother, decided she just had to leave and go back to Texas. And so she did, and I know my mother at the time that they left Idaho was with her, and they returned to Texas. And Hugh, the father, continued to stay in Pocatello, Idaho, until he died. And then Susie went back to Idaho with one of the girls, one of the daughters, to identify him, claim the body. And I don't know what happened after that. I did research it, and I did talk to people there in Pocatello, but the funeral home which handled his decease was no longer there. It hadn't been for a long, long time. And I couldn't find out where he was buried because it seemed that Susie, in her mind, thought maybe she could bring him back to Texas. But whether that happened or not, I have no idea. It would have been extremely difficult. So I would guess that he is buried somewhere in Pocatello, but I don't know where.
Yes, okay.
And
So you don't know exactly the circumstances in Texas that
at that
caused
time.
them to leave.
No, and I have come across some possibilities a
Okay.
couple of times, but
Okay.
I haven't been involved in really reading about it and the research. I was very much invested in it and involved in it at one time. So it's been a while, and I
Yes.
just can't remember,
Okay.
except that there were circumstances that were made difficult.
Mm-hmm. And then, so your mother comes back to Texas with her mother,
Yes.
which is your grandmother. And then, how long were they there, or what happened then after that?
My grandmother worked there for a while. She taught at what was called the DD&B, which was the Deaf, Dumb and Blind School. My mother, and also she had positions, I think, being in charge of female students at a couple of colleges there. Also, I'm trying to remember the names of them. Prairie View is one, college is still there, and another one. And so my mother had the experience of being around colleges as she was a young girl growing up, and went to school, I guess, at whatever those colleges provided for their faculty and offspring.
Your mother was teaching, right?
Not my mother, the grandmother.
I'm sorry, your grandmother.
Yes, yes.
At both this school for the deaf
Yes,
and blind
yes.
and a college.
Yes, but I don't know if at the same time,
Right,
but she
right,
did
but-
both. And she knew, evidently, sign language, and because my mother's sister, the one 10 years her elder, my mother's sister, Nettie, learned sign language very well and taught it, or used it to teach later on in life, yeah. So, yeah, so
Were these
that's...
schools, I'm sorry, were they segregated?
Yes, definitely so. Yes, indeed. The DD&B, where my grandmother Susie worked, was for blacks, for African Americans, for colored, whatever we were called at that time. Yeah.
I just wanted for the record to
Sure.
make sure we, yeah. And then your mother, how did your mother, what was her schooling, and eventually where did she end up?
Well, she was sent to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. That's where she went for college. And that's actually where she met my father.
What did she study?
Actually not certain what my mother studied. I don't think she was always very specific about that. I don't really know, but she was a very talented lady. I mean, as her daughter, she was an artist. She could draw and paint well. She was in exhibits. She could sew beautifully. She made clothes.
So she's an artist.
Oh, she was wonderful. She could write music, played the piano beautifully. She was very talented, creative, very creative.
So she meets your father at Fisk.
Because he was there on a trip.
Wow.
And he says that he saw her walk into the cafeteria where he was seated with some members of the faculty there at Fisk, and he wanted to know, who is that? And they said, oh, that's Hugh Hancock of Texas. And that's how he met her. By the way, she was named Hugh after her father because she was the fourth born after 10 years, and he didn't have a son.
Oh, interesting.
So he named her Hugh, but it was made Hugh Ella. And actually, my mother couldn't stand the Ella at all. She liked it to just be Hugh.
So let me just, I wanted to ask this. So you mentioned that, of course, the father was white.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering, did they live separate?
Oh, yes.
Right?
Yes.
But they were supported by the father.
Yes. Yes. Now, Hugh's father was a lawyer, I believe, and I think that he was a lawyer, and he married at about the same time that well, let me go back. Hugh's mother
Mm-hmm.
had been sent up, or had been sent to Texas by a former owner. She was a slave.
Okay.
And Hugh's father saw her on an auction block, and he bought her and took her with him. All right. So, of course, at that time, she would have been living in his residence.
Right.
All right. Now, he married a little bit after that, and at about the same time Hugh was born, the legal wife had a child as well. But he took care of Hugh, and that's, I said, was the progression where Hugh was eventually sent away to Ohio to go to school in Oberlin, and the mother as well. He sent the two of them there to live so that Hugh could be educated.
I see.
Does that help?
That's
Okay,
very helpful.
okay.
And so now, so then Hugh dies. This is your grandfather in Pocatello.
Yes, around 1910 or 1911.
Okay, and then now we're looking at your mother's education, which you said she then grows up and goes to Fisk.
Yes,
And that's where she meets your father.
yes.
And your father, you mentioned his name?
Was Thomas Montgomery Gregory. Do you want me to tell you about his background
Absolutely.
leading up to that point?
Absolutely.
Okay. My father was born in Washington, D.C., on Howard University's campus. His father had been born in Virginia. He was free, and at a certain point left Virginia again for the same circumstances. Things were going on in Virginia that made it difficult even for free people. And so his father and mother left Virginia, he was born in Lexington, Virginia, but they'd been living in Lynchburg. So they left Lynchburg when my father's father, James Monroe Gregory, was a little boy, and his brother Claiborne, when they were little boys. They left Virginia and made their way again through Illinois and Indiana and out to Ohio. And that's where my grandfather, James Monroe Gregory, went to school and was educated at Oberlin as well. But he was not sent there by a white father. It was his free parents who decided to do that, to make that happen.
Where were they living in Ohio?
In the Oberlin area, and perhaps Cleveland, and I ought to know that, but
No. But,
yeah.
but did your father pretty much grow up in, I mean, it was first, of course, Virginia, but then you said they went to Indiana?
Yes,
And
and
then to
Illinois,
And,
and then to Ohio.
and then to Ohio?
Yes.
But college age was when he was in Ohio, is that right? Or maybe he was younger?
My grandfather, yes.
Okay.
But no, he was there as a boy. As I said, they were
Okay,
two
so
little
he-
boys.
Okay,
And so they went to public school there first
I see.
in the Cleveland or Oberlin area.
In that area?
Yes, in
I
that
see.
area.
So he grew up there?
In
your
Ohio,
grandfather,
yes.
In Ohio, and then went to Oberlin.
Yes.
It's interesting, both sides went to Oberlin.
That's because, as my father said,
Mhm.
he said Oberlin was a magnet at that time for free blacks. It's somewhere where they could go and get an education and move on. And many people would read about in black history went through Oberlin at that time.
Yes, yes. What did he study?
My grandfather,
Yes.
I can't tell you, I don't know. I know one thing about him is that he was quite a forceful speaker. He was known for being able, as an orator there at school. I think maybe he was the valedictorian of his class at Oberlin when he graduated. Not at Oberlin. Well, no, that wouldn't have been, because he didn't graduate from Oberlin. That's another story. Trying to backtrack with that. Mhm.
So he studied at Oberlin, but does he have was he At Howard? Harvard? I'm trying
Well,
to
I'm
remember.
going into
You're
that.
going into that, okay.
Yes, because while he was at Oberlin, someone, I think it was a General Butler in Massachusetts, contacted Oberlin and wanted to know someone they would recommend colored who would be able to be admitted to was it West Point Air Force? Yeah, it must have been West Point as a cadet at that time. And so he was recommended. James Monroe Gregory was the one that the contacted Oberlin recommended. And so as a result of that, he left Oberlin to come to Washington for interviews. And in coming, and the community evidently of free black people was so small, and Howard University, I think, this was in 1867 or so, had just begun to function. And so he met General Oliver Otis Howard, who was one of the founders of Howard University, you know, one of the people he interacted with and met at that time. And so then after, I don't know who he spoke with other than that in terms of his being eligible to go to West Point. But when he returned to Ohio, he found out that he had not been accepted. They would not take him. And so General Howard found out about it, and he invited James Monroe Gregory to return, to come back to Washington and to be the first student in the collegiate, as they called it, the collegiate department of the university. And so in 1868, he entered Howard University as the first student in the collegiate department. Now there was another part of the university, the normal school, and there were 4 little white girls there. And one time, I remember when I was writing about my grandfather and father, and I called the university public affairs office to confirm something, and I said something about the first graduates of the university, and they said they were 4 little white. I said, no, they were not in the collegiate department. So he was the first student there, and he was joined eventually by 2 more men, young men. The last name of one was Settles, and the last name of the other was O'Hare. And the 3 of them graduated in 1872 together, with James Monroe Gregory as the valedictorian. And and then my grandmother, James Monroe Gregory, met her at Howard University because she'd been sent there by her mother and was a student in one of his classes. Because when he graduated, he stayed on to teach Latin and math. She was in a class of his, and I understand from my father that he would send her notes. And so they married, I think it was about perhaps 1879. But her mother was interesting. She was she was an entrepreneur herself. My grandmother Fanny, that was her name, Fanny's mother was she was my most favorite character in the family history.
Where did she grow up?
In Maryland, in the Jerusalem area, which was near Frederick. And the same circumstances sent her out of, as a free person, she was free, out of Maryland. And she took a train to Philadelphia. She was free and evidently had the wherewithal to, I don't know where she got it from actually when she was in Frederick, maybe from family or Jerusalem, Maryland. But she was able to leave. And on the train, as I understand it from my father, 2 white women hid her under their skirts, you know, the big skirts. And so she went to Philadelphia, and she applied to be a student in a school there. I can't remember the school, what type of school it was. But they took her money, but then they refused to admit her. She sued them, and she got her money back. She operated a laundry in, I don't know if it's Philadelphia or Williamsport, because she made her way to Williamsport. And she operated a laundry, and then she made her way to Washington, D.C. to study at a place called Dr. Hosford's Sanitarium. There, she learned the practice of medical electricity, or electrical medicine as it was called, one of those two at that time. She returned to Williamsport and set herself up in business as a practitioner of this electrical medicine or medical electricity. And it's, you can read about it. I went to the library and I got a book about it.
And this was a school in Washington, D.C.?
Not a school per se,
Yeah,
but all I know, it was called Dr. Hosford's Sanitarium.
Sanitarium, interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
So she learned
Was
there.
it a black establishment?
Not Dr. Hosford, no, I don't think so.
Okay.
So she went back to Williamsport, and she opened up what nowadays, I guess, would be considered similar to a spa. And people would go to her from all backgrounds, of people who owned the streetcar company, the man who owned the lumber, whatever they did, they went to her, the wonderful woman in electricity. That's how she was referred to at one point. And so, just to give you a little look into how she became one of my favorite characters, not just because of what she accomplished like that, because she set herself up in business and she was very successful, but there was, I think it was the owner of the streetcar company was one of her regular customers. And I understand from my father that one time he came for treatment to the wonderful woman in electricity, who at that time had noticed that the streetcars running by her business were not stopping any longer. When a client of hers, a patient, was ready to leave, the patient would stand there with a white flag and the streetcar would stop. It had ceased happening. Just a couple of times she'd noticed that no longer would the streetcar stop at her establishment. It just went by. So while he was in her unit, she started turning up the heat and asking him about it.
Wow.
Until he finally agreed to renew the stop there. Oh, that's only one of the stories about her. But she was quite a figure, quite a character, quite a figure, very brave, very bold, and very competent and capable. And and she had a daughter. She had more than one daughter, but we weren't really familiar with growing up who the other offspring she had were, but she did have a couple others. But it was, her name was Margaret, my great-grandmother this is, but her daughter Fanny was my father's mother. And she's the one that sent Fanny to Howard University at a time when very few women at all were being sent to universities.
This was when Howard had just started as a
In the
college.
beginning years.
Yes.
Yes,
Amazing.
in the beginning years, yes. Now she was younger, obviously, than her to-be husband, James Monroe Gregory. He was a teacher and she was a student. But
So they met?
yes,
and they
there.
married?
Yes, they married in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, where her mother was living, and yes, where she.
And then, but then they lived at Howard, or?
And then, yes, because he was on the faculty at Howard then, so so Fanny and James Monroe Gregory had their house, their home, on Howard University's campus. That's where my father was born. James Monroe Gregory also at one point became the dean of the school, not ongoing, but for a period of time he was. He taught Latin and math at one time. And then Latin and Greek I've forgotten now, but I know Latin, part of it. And he also established, and I don't know if he did it alone or with other people probably, an organization for the education of colored youth. And he became the first director of it and was, I think, ongoing the director, the head of it for years, but he was still on the faculty at Howard.
And that organization, what did it do?
I'm not certain, to be truthful, except that it must have done something to enable young colored kids to get an education. So, in some way, I think it was national.
And so they raised the family?
Yes, they did. They had 4 offspring as well, as my mother's parents had. And so Fanny and James Monroe Gregory had, let's see, they had 2 sons, and then a daughter, and then my father 10 years later. And so they were at Howard University for a period of time, but my grandfather left Howard University. I've forgotten what year that was. Now I can't, it's not coming to mind. But after many, many years there on the faculty, he left and moved to New Jersey to head up the Bordentown School, which was called the Manual and Industrial Training School for Colored Youth. And so that started another phase, which is extremely interesting. But so my father was at Howard University until about age 10, and then the move to New Jersey, to Bordentown, New Jersey, and so that's where Fanny helped. James Monroe Gregory headed the school there, which when he arrived was in rather sad condition. It had been started by a minister, I've forgotten his name now, and it was Manual Industrial Training School. So he took it over, and he got money from the state of New Jersey to make improvements. I think he erecting even a new building or so, and just created quite a place that was referred to as the Tuskegee of the North. But the difference was that he wanted to have more emphasis on academics, of course, with his background. And so he did bring that to bear there. He did bring in his wife, Fanny, played quite a role in supporting him and overseeing any female students who were there. And she was very active, as I understand it, at Howard, even when they were at Howard, with him as support, and then again at Bordentown. So my father was a young boy in Bordentown, but then he went away to school. He was sent to Williston Academy up in Massachusetts, and I guess he was then maybe about 12 or so, and 13, because he was there for what would be called high school now. And he was there, he showed such promise. He was on the debating team. He excelled in debating. I think he was editor of the school newspaper. Now, it wasn't easy always because, again, he was African American, colored, black, and one of maybe 2 or 3 students there who were. And so he, I know, suffered some indignities, but he just pursued. And so I called there once to, oh, do you know what? I'm saying my grandfather. Oh no, I did tell you it was my father, okay, because they both did similar things. Yeah. So at any rate, I called the archivist at Williston once when I was researching for an article I was writing about my dad. And I said something about the fraternity, and he said, the archivist said, oh, no, they weren't allowed. I said, but they were. Maybe you didn't know it and weren't supposed to know it. Maybe the administration was not knowledgeable. But there was a fraternity because I saw in my father's papers, I read so much about him after his death that I didn't know. He never complained about anything. I read that he had not been admitted or allowed by the students to become part of their fraternity or club, whatever, and started his own. He and another student from Mexico and a couple of other students who were white but evidently just weren't considered acceptable. They started their own, so I gave that information to the archivist.
Great.
Yes.
This is Dartmouth.
No, this was at Williston
Williston.
Academy
Sorry. Yes,
in
yes,
Massachusetts,
yes.
yeah,
Yes,
the
yes.
boarding school.
Okay.
The boarding school. And he
So
went,
he started his own club.
yes, yes. In other words, I
Yeah.
have discovered, would find the way. He would find a way, the way, in most cases. He had that kind of determination and self-confidence. It took enormous self-confidence, but look at his father,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
and his mother both. They were strong people. So my father graduated from Williston and entered Harvard University in the class of 1906. Now, his brother, his eldest brother, her elder brother, Eugene, graduated from Harvard in, I think, 1895 or I think it was 1895. And so he was the second one of the family to go to Harvard. The other brother, Frank, went to Amherst. And Margaret, the one who was 10 years older than my father, went to Boston College. And that's where she was in school. So my father entered Harvard, and he was very active again in everything in sports, and also he got on the debating team there, and he was on the most celebrated debate ever to happen at Harvard, and that was what they called the triangle debate between Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. He was on the team. And so he graduated from Harvard in 1910. I know only that he took classes in English, of course, and theater, drama. There was a person there named George Pierce Baker, who was extremely well known as a person who was expert at teaching drama. And my father happened to take a couple of classes with him. But I know, I found out after, way long after he was gone, deceased. I never heard him speak of it, ever. I found out what he had hoped to do when he graduated from Harvard was to work for the State Department, I found that out by reading letters, and he was turned down. So at that time, even then, 1910, of course, there were very few openings available to educated blacks. They often ended up, many of them, teaching at the universities, the black universities, as he did, and so he went to Howard. And he became a faculty member at Howard. He actually was led to believe somehow or other that this would happen. While a student at Howard, he had many positive contacts with people, and evidently he felt that through some of these contacts he would be able to be accepted and admitted into service at the State Department, but it did not happen at all. And so then he was able, of course, as I said, to get on the faculty at Howard University. And so it was not his first choice to teach English at all, but that's what he did. He taught English there and drama, and he also started the debating club there. I told you he met my mother like that. He took a big debating team to Fisk. That's how he ended up going to Fisk. The trip, I said, he took his debating team to Fisk. And so he started the debating team. He started the Howard Players, founded. There was a debating club there already, but he started the Howard Players, which in many ways evidently was just more so. And it was George Pierce Baker, his student, his teacher at Harvard, who was his mentor in the ways that he saw to develop that the Howard players, and also in his ability to instruct or to have students instructed in how to write their own stories, because evidently Baker emphasized that at Harvard. So he got one of his colleagues at Howard University, Alain Locke. He was very supportive of my father. They were colleagues and they supported each other. They both were Harvard graduates. And so Alain Locke had his students developing, who were interested in able stories that for the Howard players to enact. And so this was looked at with great interest by a couple of other theater groups, the Provincetown Players and the Carolina Players. And so it was becoming very, very successful, the Howard Players, and he got to know Eugene O'Neill, who was a playwright in New York, because O'Neill had a play on Broadway starring a black actor named Charles Gilpin in the title role of the Emperor Jones. And my father went up to New York and he saw the play and he got to know Eugene O'Neill, and he got Eugene O'Neill to agree to let Charles Gilpin come to Washington, D.C. to star in his title role as the Emperor of the Emperor Jones with the Howard players as cast. And I understand that it may have been the first time and the only time in years and years that there was an integrated audience, because everyone was familiar with O'Neill's play, The Emperor Jones, and to have this occasion. So he was able to accomplish that one night only, but the Howard players were the cast for the play, The Emperor Jones.
And it was an integrated audience.
Yes, and it was held at the Belasco Theater, which was at Lafayette Square, where the White House is close to, yes. So at the Belasco Theater on that evening, can't remember the date, that was quite an occasion.
Of course.
Yes. So he, like his father, was just very full of ideas and follow through and self-confidence and capabilities. And so...
And your mother?
Well, as I said, he took a debating team to
Yes.
Fisk University and saw my mother walk into the cafeteria.
That's right. Okay.
And that's how he met her. I think that was around 1916, something like that. And they corresponded over the next year or two, and they married in 1918 in Baltimore, Maryland, where my father's sister, Aunt Margaret, who was 10 years older, lived with her family. And that's where they were married. My mother came up from Texas, and so there we are.
And so then they both lived on
Howard's campus, yes.
And they had a family.
Yes, they had, at that time, 4 children. My sister Yvonne, the eldest, my brother named after my father, Thomas Montgomery Gregory, Jr., and my brother Hugh Hancock, named after my mother, Hugh Hancock Gregory, and my brother Eugene. Those were the 4 children then at Howard. And so my father wanted, you see, he had something more he wanted to accomplish. Not only did he have that disappointment at Harvard about not being able to go ahead with working with the State Department, but at Howard University, he was trying to put together a national Negro theater company. And he had interest expressed by people across the country. The Provincetown Players, the Carolina Players, Eugene O'Neill's, an article in Life magazine. There was all kinds of interest shown. But he wasn't getting any support at Howard for this National Negro Theater, which was what it was going to be called. And so that was a great disappointment to him. But another thing he did while he was at Howard, while he was there, that was outstanding, is that when the World War I was starting, he, as well as a lot of other people in the Negro community, the black community, were concerned that while there were black soldiers, there were no black officers. And no way to train black officers at all existed. And so my father became one of a group of people from they called it the Central Committee of Negro College Men, I think, who decided they were going to petition the War Department. And my father set up in the chapel of Howard University, in the basement of Howard University headquarters. And you see, he had contacts at that time in the War Department because Joel Spingarn, who actually was one of the heads of the NAACP, he was Jewish, was in some capacity there in the War Department. My father met him, knew him through other activities he was involved in. And also Walter Lippmann was there, you know, the famed journalist, my father's classmate at Howard University. And so lots of people were raising their voices in the black community, people on the college level in particular at different universities, about the fact that there needed to be training for black officers. And my father, for some reason or other, was in the forefront quite a bit. And so I know that he got assistance from Walter Lippmann, who would pass on his remarks or his petitions to the Secretary of War. Same thing with Joel Spingarn. And so it really came to pass. And so Black Officers Training Camp was established at Fort Des Moines, Iowa. And so that was another enormous accomplishment of my father's. So at any rate, then the National Negro Theater, the president at that time's name was Durkee. President Durkee was white. They were in the beginning white presidents of Howard. Would not support it. In fact, he didn't support much of what anyone on the faculty wanted to do. He was that kind of person. I found out he was a racist, really. And he was in that position, but he was a racist. And so my father came upon that opposition, and it was very strong, and he wasn't able to overcome it. And so he decided to leave. And like his father before him, went to New Jersey. And there was an opening in New Jersey for a supervisor of colored schools. And so he accepted that position. But imagine, from having founded the Howard Players, from having founded the debating club, also a newsletter called The Stylus, he and Elaine Locke together started for students who might have an interest and talent in writing, because there was no outlet for them whatsoever in the white media and the white press and the white publishing companies. So they would be able to send what they wrote into the campus paper, The Stylus. So after all of that, it had to be heartbreaking, but he did it. He left, and he went to Atlantic City, New Jersey, which is how I happened to be born there. My sister Mignon was born there before me. She was born in 11 years ahead of me, about 1927, I think. I think I'm right. And I was born in 1938. So the two of us were children there.
But a very major disappointment for you.
Of course, for my father. Had to be enormous. And I found that out in other ways later on in my life. I remember, how much time do we have? I'm sorry. Okay. I remember growing up, sometimes when my father was in the bathroom shaving, getting ready to go out, I'd hear him suddenly say something, and it was, "Were you there when I was there?" And I used to think it was so strange. You know, every once in a while, "Were you there when I was there?" And sometimes it was, "Were you there when I was there? I don't give a damn. Do you, Hugh?" Out would come these things, out of his thoughts. And "Were you there when I was there?" And actually, well, I don't care, but "Were you there when I was there?" And then when I was looking through some of his papers recently, I saw a quote, and I meant to get it so I could bring it, but I didn't, in which it is stated, "What will you see of me when I'm gone? What things will come to light?" That's the essence of it, but those aren't the words. Yeah.
So he went to New Jersey, and that's where you were born?
Yes, he went to, and he became the supervisor of the colored schools, and eventually principal of one of them. And he continued to be active in the theater world to some extent. He would be asked to come up and to review plays. In fact, he reviewed Jean Toomer's play. What was the name of his book, rather? Forgotten. But he continued for a bit, but not forever. And he also was involved in a little theater group he dealt with there in Atlantic City as well. So for a period of time, he also, oh, I forgot, something else that he did was that he did some work for the NAACP for their magazine, their organ called The Crisis Opportunity, The Crisis. He took trips down to the South on segregated cars to write what it was like, to reveal what it was like for colored people to travel aboard these segregated cars and trains, and the cars on the trains. A segregated car was horrendous from his descriptions, just awful. I mean, really neglected, tight compartment area compared to the other cars on the train, not always kept clean, just terrible conditions. So he wrote 3 articles for the Crisis magazine about that. Yes, while he was in New Jersey.
While he was in New Jersey. And is that where they stayed then?
In New Jersey. They, well, yes, until my father retired.
Okay.
And when he retired, they moved back to Washington, and I was here at that time because I had already started Howard University. So,
and in New Jersey, was your mother doing work?
well, she never really, not while her children were little and growing up. When I came along, my mother did do something. She started hand painting scarves, and she took them to boardwalk shops and made some sales of her artwork on these scarves. I always meant to save the one I had, and I couldn't find it. But yes, she did that.
Very nice.
And in
So
Atlantic
her art
City.
seems to be there throughout her life.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
very nice.
So she did that in Atlantic City. I'm trying to think, did she do anything else in Atlantic City? I don't think so at the moment. I can't recall of anything, because my mother didn't really work there.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. But what was it like for you to grow up in Atlantic City?
Interesting. We lived in a segregated neighborhood because Atlantic City, although it wasn't overtly segregated and racist and, you know, overt way out there, at the same time the neighborhoods were segregated. And so we lived in a black community, which was fine, but I'll tell you the advantage of it, because you had people from all walks of life. You had in the neighborhood a plumber, you had professors, you had doctors, you had dentists, you had all kinds of people living, carpenters,
cooks,
everything.
yes.
You know, people who worked doing menial work in the hotels. You know, everyone was in the segregated community. So as I said later in life, I was awfully glad I grew up like that because I didn't have any stuck-up attitudes about people. You know, I thought that was very grounding, you know, very good way to grow up. So at any rate, what was I to say?
I was just.
Oh, what it was like, yeah. So that elementary school was segregated. That's what I was getting to, up until the 6th grade. But after the 6th grade in Atlantic City, there was one junior high school, or middle school as they're called. So that was the beginning of integration for us when I went to school. And the junior high school, middle school was integrated. I don't remember that being very special or unusual or weird in any way whatsoever, you know. In fact, I think I knew one of the teachers, there were a couple of African-American teachers there. And one of them was my godmother. I think she was my homeroom teacher at one point. But it was just, you know,
Yes.
I didn't find it strange at all that there were white kids in my classes. I remember there was one Puerto Rican girl, Paula, who came to school there for the first time, first Puerto Rican ever. You know, it was just different. Our family had moved to Atlantic City, I think, for work on the ocean in some way. So then high school. There was only one public high school, Atlantic City High School, which was an excellent school back in those days. It had been for years. Again, totally open, integrated, everything. You know, so I never found any what shall I say, discrimination personally, except one teacher. That was the woman who was in charge of the drama guild. She really resented me. I remember one time there were a number of us trying out for a particular play, and everyone had to read a part, and when I read mine, I was the only person they clapped for. All the other students clapped for me. She wouldn't give me a part. One time, I remember I was just so irritated. I went home and I asked my mother, I said, "Mother, may I have a copy of that piece that Daddy wrote for the Encyclopedia Britannica on the Negro and drama?" And so it was also a leaflet. It was in the Encyclopedia Britannica, but there was this leaflet. And I took it, and I took it to her, and I said, "I just thought you might be interested in this." And I remember just her saying, "Yeah, thank you, dear." But it never changed anything. I think I can remember in the school class play, I was given the part of a milkmaid, but then it was on 2 nights, and the person who played the milkmaid in the other night was also black. And that's exactly where her head was. I can remember when there was a celebration or a special evening one time in the auditorium, wherever. It wasn't the auditorium, but someplace in the school where you could hold social affairs. There was a group that had come from another New Jersey town to meet with us, and so while our drama club. And so during the evening when there was dancing and so forth, I remember this white head, the one who was the president of the other school's drama group, came and asked me to dance. I will never forget this woman looking over and peering at me, and just, I mean, it was so obvious. But it was the only time I ever experienced that kind of discrimination in the school. But it stuck with me, as you see. It was so obvious. It was so obvious to me.
And the students, you all got along?
Oh, yeah, we did. We certainly did. Yeah, because I'm trying to remember. Oh, one interesting time I can remember is when we were going, well, the thing is that, again, the neighborhoods were segregated. So there were certain communities that were practically part of Atlantic City, Ventnor, Margate, and Longport. It was like Washington, Silver Spring, Bethesda, and so forth. And so one evening, I forget what the occasion was, whether it was senior year or something. I remember that a few of us were invited by one of our white classmates to come to a party. And so my friend Gordon was driving. His family owned a funeral home, so we weren't in one of the, you know, what do you call it? But we were in I guess one of, yeah. And Gordon and myself and maybe another couple. And I remember that we were stopped on the way, driving along the main street, Atlantic Avenue out there. The policeman wanted to know where we were going. And you know what I did? I mean, this was me growing up in my family. I mean, I looked at him and I said, "Excuse me, can you tell me what time it is?" You know, and then he let us go on. But that happened. And then I know that blacks were not allowed to go into the hotels as customers, you know, as, to rent rooms, you know, to be there. They worked there. But there was never any reason to go for us, you know, for me. I mean, after all, we lived there, but people came from all over. And those who were black who came over had to go to special houses, rooming houses that were owned by black people, and also to rent rooms in the homes of people who were open to having them come in and spend time. I know that we had a woman come who was from a family my father knew in D.C. She came to teach in Atlantic City, and my father and mother let her stay with us for a while. So that was done because they could not stay in hotels at all. Restaurants was the same, but again, we had our own restaurants, and so it never really affected me in any large sense. I really don't think it ever really did, because I had opportunities and things to do, and my friends did, and so forth. I would come to Washington. I know I had cousins here, and they had a home at a private beach, and I would go and stay with them. And then later on, my sister got married, and she lived here, and I would come and visit her. And so I, you know, didn't feel like I had nothing to do with my life, you know, that I was stymied and oppressed, but I was aware. And the reason I think I was even as aware as I was, and maybe more so even than a lot of my peers, was because of my older brothers and sisters. Because my oldest sister lived in New York, and she was a writer and a poet, and she was writing for one time for the Philadelphia Afro-American newspaper, but she also wrote for Paul Robeson's newspaper, Freedom, and she also wrote for Adam Clayton Powell's newspaper,
What was her name?
Yvonne Gregory. And so for a period of time, she was so active. I can remember her coming home one time and describing a trip that she took down to the South to cover an incident that had taken place where this black woman who worked on a farm with her two sons had been assaulted by a white man, and it had blown up into quite a well-known, I mean, people were talking about it, it was in the news. I think maybe the sons might have tried to defend her. So my sister came home and she talked about this. And so I would hear stories. My brother, another brother, lived in New York City. I mean, my brothers and sisters were coming home periodically, so I'd hear stories. And so I was very well aware of the fact that there was this discrimination, this racism going on. It just so happened that it did not directly impact me in ways that I suffered. You know, it did not. My sister was very, very talented, but she wasn't able to continue. She had me come up one time to a camp in New York, which I found out later was a camp that was of people who were progressives, as they were called, sent their children. And it was relatively new then, and it was integrated. There were black and white kids there, Jewish, you know, different backgrounds. And it was really delightful, but I was 8 years old then, and she had me come up to New York a lot to spend time with her and exposed me to all kinds of things. But in this case, it was the camp, and I was there, and it was a sleepover camp, obviously, up in the, was it the Catskills, the Adirondacks, up in the mountains of New York. So she did that for me, as well as other things. I can remember her taking me to a block party. What was a block party? I'd never heard of a block party before, but there, at one time she took me out on a barge with a picnic lunch out on the water, you know. She took me to a restaurant where there were little birds singing in a cage. And I learned to enjoy pizza while I was up there for the first time.
And this sister is Yvonne.
Yvonne.
Yes.
She was very, very special to me. Her loss was a great loss for me when she died, but she became ill. She had some emotional and mental issues that prevented her from being consistent in her work. And she worked as an editor at some point and so forth. And so, well, I ended up doing a lot of things that she did, you know, to some extent. But she could not continue, you know, she wasn't able to. And when she passed away from cancer in New York, it was traumatic for me, really. Because she was like another mother to me. She was like another mother. She was old enough. She was about 20 when I was born, and she was in college then. Yeah.
So you finished high school, and you said you came to Howard University.
Yes.
And what was that like?
Different. And I'd been coming, though, up here for so long to visit cousins and then my sister and her family here. In fact, my sister and her husband lived very near campus, so I was accustomed to walking across and being on Howard's campus. And I had thought of maybe, I was very talented, I'll say, in art, all right? And my art teacher used to say, well, you ought to major in art. Well, I was thinking of going to Pratt Institute as one thing I was thinking of in my head that I'd like to do. Then also it came up that maybe I would go to Barnard College up in New York. And yet, I went to Howard University because a couple of my siblings emphasized to me that they thought I should go to Howard University. Now, I know it was because of I think one of them said, well, because I had gone to integrated schools so long, that it would be a good experience for me to be in an all-black setting. And not anything to do with my father or my grandfather at all, just the fact that it was a black university, the experience. And then also, I think perhaps they had in mind the fact that it would have been so much less expensive than my going, if my parents had to support my going to Barnard College, you know. So I don't know, I never was told anything, but I did decide, okay, to go to Howard. And so when I came, I lived in the dormitory and made lots of friends. I remember one of my brothers saying, be careful not to get in with the finger poppers. You know? And so, at any rate, I lived in, there was Truth Hall for the first freshman year, and so that was...
What did you study?
Well, in the beginning, I started out in art, and then I decided, well, I was doing in the art class some of the same things that I'd already been doing in high school, I suppose, I guess. I remember that, and feeling like, oh, I want to move on, you know. So it was necessary starting out to do it, but it's just that I happened to have had some of that already. And so I, for that reason, was maybe deciding that I didn't want to stick with art. And then I had this brother who said that I should not think about doing things in fields like art and theater, because after all, I'd end up living on a string, you know, that I'd be like on a, what is it, living on a shoestring.
Yes.
And he knew, because he was in New York and he knew all this. And so he was like always concerned about my welfare. That was the bottom line. But his insistence that that would be silly of me and not a good idea of me to major in art or in theater also contributed to my decision, therefore, to do something else that I did well and I enjoyed, and that was foreign languages. So therefore, I majored in Spanish with a minor in education, and as life would have it, after all of that and teaching for a while, I ended up in television. You know,
Nice.
yeah.
So you finished at Howard and
Yes,
stayed in Washington,
yes,
D.C.?
yes.
And then tell
And
us
I,
about television.
Well, I was teaching in a foreign languages and elementary schools program called FLES. It was wonderful, wonderful creative program, which is why I liked it and agreed to do it, because I didn't want to be in a traditional classroom teaching the traditional way with the book and so forth. I wanted to be where you could really express and use props and so forth, and so that was that program. And so,
Was it in public schools?
yes, public schools, elementary school level. And so I did that for several years, also married, and had one son in 1963 and another son in 1968. So it was just after the younger son had, that was in fact, I was, yeah, in 68, because I went into television in 69. He was a year old. Yeah. I decided to take a friend's recommendation or suggestion. She called and said to me, oh, by the way, they're having auditions for a program at Channel 7. I thought you might be interested. And I said, okay, well, why not? I think I was on maternity leave at that time, I think. So I hadn't gone back to teaching. Maybe it was summer, but I know I was able to do that. So I called the station, and I spoke to, I believe it was the program manager, and he said, I'm sorry, but the auditions are closed. So we continued talking a bit, and then we talked more. And then after a while, he said, well, why don't you come in and audition? So after all of that, I went in and I did audition, and I was the one hired. So, you know, it's just, and even my being willing and feeling able to move ahead and even call about that. I was in the Howard Players, by the way. I was in that group, but I just didn't think anything of it. I called up, yes, that sounds like a good idea. Let me see. And then to be told, well, it's all over. You know, it's no way that you can be part of this now. So I was hired, and in the beginning, I was acting as in the role of a co-producer, production assistant. That was it, with a talk show. And so that's how I got my introduction to television. And then I found out that what they wanted was for me to create a children's educational television program. Well, that fit in with my background, didn't it? And so I did that. My mother thought of the name The Magic Door, because this was going to be a door magically for some kids open to new experiences and things like that, of that nature. I even incorporated, I was able to put Spanish into it because in a little, I think a few minutes segment of each hour, I don't know if it was daily or every other day or so, I would do Spanish because I had a Muppet character we got eventually, and I would teach Jelly Bean the Muppet some Spanish. And so this was also part of the program. We did science, I read stories. I really was particularly interested in reaching students, kids in the Black community and in the Latino community. And so the stories that I read were stories that would appeal to them in particular as well as to white children. And I did a lot of things that were new and different in that respect, really.
How many years?
4 years. And then they fired me. I won several awards. I won Action for Children's Television, which was very, if you're not familiar with that, Action for Children's Television was a big thing then in educational TV for kids. The American, what was it, American University Women's Association 3 years in a row. Capital Press Club, I forget what else, articles and so forth. But you see, they didn't give me credit on the air at the end for being the producer of that, for producing. There was a director, but he had no background in education. He couldn't have come up with the ideas I did to put together this, create this program. But I wasn't, all I was talent, you know, and it just became untenable to me that I should really be the person with the ideas putting it together and that I was not being given credit for it. So I protested. And at one point I said, all right, if you say I'm not producing, I will not do it. And so I stopped producing. And I just, in other words, go ahead. So what they did was they hired a consultant to come in and help the director and the production assistant put together some programs. But that was very distasteful to them, of course, and very unusual, of course. I mean, who did that? Nobody would say, I'm not going to do it. But I did. And so a lawyer I talked to said to me, well, Sheila, you know, if you don't agree to just accept it, because they told me, well, that's the way we've always done it. If you don't agree, they won't renew your contract. And I said, I don't care. So that's how it ended.
I see. Okay.
That's how it ended. And I was sorry. The thing I was sorriest about was that there were things that I had begun that I wouldn't be able to take on, like different cultures, different ways of eating with chopsticks, having people come on who were from India to talk about their customs and so forth. Japan wanted me, the embassy of Japan, to do something on Japan, African embassy. So there were things I was starting to do to really grow. I did have another component of my show called Magic Door in the Streets, which was my idea, to go out into the community. And this was once every so often with Jelly Bean's cousin, which we had made up. And it would go, and I had two people from the station go. One would play a guitar, and the other one would sing along with him, and we'd sing songs with the children. And I also had children come into the studio to watch the program in progress, so they'd see that it wasn't really magic, that it was done in this way, yeah. I had an author, John Steptoe, come in, who had a wonderful book out called The Snowy Day, which was about a little black child and his learning about snow and so forth. It was just a delightful, wonderful book. So I had him come in and talk, and that was because we set up a segment every once a week called I Can Be. I can be what? I can be a writer. I can be, I had Muhammad Ali on.
Wow.
He agreed to come on. We were doing a segment on a theme that day on rules and regulations. And he sat there and he talked about how if he had followed the rules of this one particular time, he wouldn't have lost the fight he lost. But he lost because he didn't listen. He didn't follow what he was to do. So I was able to bring that in. So it was very interesting, I think it was. After television, I did a number of things, writing and media consulting, public relations, all in communications, that kind of thing.
So writing, what were you
Yeah.
writing?
I wrote about my great-grandmother Margaret Muhammad, and that was published in one of the magazines of the Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and History. I wrote for the Afro-American National Biography Project, which was a child of Henry Louis Gates and what's her name, Higginbotham, yeah. And I did 3 articles for them. One on my grandfather, one on my other grandfather, and one on my father. And I used to write also for the National Park Service. I did some things for them in their newsletter. Variety of things. I've always written, yeah. But for a period of time now. I haven't done anything lately. With me, it seems a matter of something coming up and my saying, oh, I can do it, I'll do it, you know.
Sure. And so after, you know, you really ended up staying in Washington, D.C., right?
Yes, for a while. Most of my life has been here, but I did spend 2 years up on Martha's Vineyard. And to me, that was lovely because it reminded me of my home, Atlantic City, because of the water, the ocean. And it was a resort place mostly, you know, with people coming in the summers. And I had friends who lived up there. So I was up there for about 2 years or so, maybe a little more. Well, one time, the people who were producing and filming Jaws came to Martha's Vineyard. And so they announced that they were looking for people to come and audition or to play part. So I said, oh, well, why not, you know, again. So I went and was one of those who stood and was interviewed. And so I was chosen as an extra. And I would have been able to do more than that because I could tell the director really wanted me to do something else. But I had gotten so involved in an interesting conversation with one of the other extras that I ignored it. And that was a no-no. And I think it was that he wanted me to take off my hat, a tam of some sort I was wearing. I think that was what it was, and I never did it. So there were some scenes with me, but it's just that I know I bit myself, and, you know, I did. Another instance, you know, yeah.
So you were up there for 2 years?
Yes, yes.
And, but then your children grew up in D.C.?
Yes, for those 2 years they were with their father.
Okay.
Yes, yes. And then one of the reasons I came back was because of my children, because I wouldn't have been able to live up there the way I would have wanted as a single parent, you know, because if you weren't a native, there were certain things you couldn't do. I couldn't teach because I was not a native. Yeah. So that time.
So I usually end these interviews by simply asking if you have anything to say to the younger generation of African Americans.
Well, yes, I'd say don't believe that you cannot do something. Just believe that there are possibilities and there are opportunities, and to be alert to opportunities when they come along, and to take advantage of opportunities as when they come. And if you don't see any, sometimes you can create them, but especially when opportunities present themselves, to be sure and respond.